All right, so as you probably saw from the title, this is going to be a little bit different than the other Objectivist Q&As that I've done, which is my focus here is going to be on questions that I can't answer, or that I fully can't answer. And part of my motivation is simply like you guys sent in a lot of interesting questions, and I thought it would be fun to see like how would I approach something where I don't actually already have a very confident, processed conclusion. But there's another reason that I wanted to do this, which is more selfish, which is I'm very wary of being in a position of having, expectations that I have to live up to versus just being really authentic about what I know and don't know. And, there's an implication of doing an objectivist Q&A of, all right, well, I can answer any question about objectivism, and then like feeling like that's something I have to live up to. And I should say, like, early in my career, this is a mistake I made. I've talked about this in various places about feeling like, all right, I am the objectivist authority, at least on some sub issue, and therefore, like, there's a kind of an anxiety and role playing that goes on in order to live up to that kind of impossible standard, at least a standard that was unrealistic for me at the time. And I want to go out of my way to avoid that and stress, like, there's a million things in objectivism that I don't understand or don't fully understand. And so here's kind of like a big public proclamation of that fact, so that if somebody corners me at Ocon and asks me something, they will not bow in disappointment when I say, I don't know. So let's dive in. I think it should be pretty fun. Okay, let's start off with this one. Why is entity an axiom but not a basic axiom? Is it because entity is not basic to understanding objectivism? So I have to be honest, like, I was almost tempted not to include this because I thought, well, I can look that up and like give you an answer pretty easily. But this is the kind of question where, like, I don't have an answer because, though I'm super interested in epistemology, the question itself doesn't seem very relevant to me. Like, I don't understand the reason why it's important, or you would even need to distinguish between basic axioms and other kinds of axioms, or basic axiomatic concepts and other kinds. There might be very important philosophic things that hinge on that, and like, I would be really curious to hear that, but because I have not seen why this is an issue, it's not something that I've explored in any depth or thought about. Like, I recall vaguely encountering, either in the ITOE workshops or elsewhere, maybe in one of Leonard Peikoff's question and answers, addressing this sort of thing. But I don't see what hinges on the issue, and so it's hard to think about the issue, and it's certainly hard to be motivated to think about the issue. My hunch is that it has to do with the fact that, an axiomatic concept is like entity. Entity is an axiomatic concept because it's perceptually self-evident, primary, and that it's probably not a basic axiom because there's no rule that everything that exists has to be an entity. And in fact, Einrein says the sky that I'm looking at right now is not an entity, but the sky exists. Or she talks about, concepts, she'll refer to them as mental entities, but really the more accurate thing to call them are mental somethings. And so my guess is that that's probably what the distinction hinges on, but I don't know that for a fact, and I don't know what's at stake in getting that right. So the part of what I want to know in order to think about this issue is, like, what hinges on it? Why are we making this distinction between basic axioms and other axioms? So that's sort of where I'd come from. And one of my concerns is for the questioner, and I don't know this for a fact, but I think it's often that they don't see what hinges on it, but here's a distinction in objectivism, and if I'm supposed to know objectivism, I need to be able to explain this distinction, and so, I need to have an answer to that. But my attitude and what I want others to cultivate is, until I see why this is an important issue, I don't really care. Like, if I don't even understand why Ayn Rand's talking about concept formation in the first place, then I don't care. Now, you can be interested. You could think, well, I know Ayn Rand's pretty smart. Why does she think this is an issue? But that should be the primary. The primary is, what in reality are we looking to see that this is even a real question? And then I'll be interested in the answer, I'll be interested in objectivism's answer, and I'll be able to evaluate it. Because I don't think you can really evaluate any issue in philosophy without seeing what in reality gives rise to the question. Just trying to understand the answer in its own terms or in a vacuum, I think gets you nowhere. So, like I said, I wouldn't have an answer for you, and I don't, except for like think about why this is an issue for you and think about why this is an issue in philosophy, and then that should give you the lead to an answer. Next question. The dim hypothesis and the ominous parallels are in those. Dr. Peikoff brilliantly illustrates the influence of Kant's destructive fundamentals. What do you think is the reason why Kant's fundamentals are so convincing to most intellectuals, and why did the intellectuals who spread parts of his system discard his classical liberal politics? And I was really happy to get this question because it allows me to make a point that I've wanted to make for a while, which is, Ayn Rand talks a lot about Kant. She thinks he's the most influential and most evil philosopher in modern history and the person who really ended the Enlightenment. And so if you listen to like objectivist lectures or read objectivist articles, it is very likely that if we're talking about some problem or evil in the world, we're rooting it ultimately in Kant. But as a general rule, if you look at my stuff, with very, very few exceptions, I never mention his name. And it's not because I disagree with the objectivist view, it's because I don't have a first-hand understanding of Kant. I know, quote, a lot about him, and that obviously I've heard all the objectivist takes on him. I've listened to, Leonard's course. I've spoken with people who've studied with like the philosophic authorities on Kant. I've taken in a lot of secondary materials, but aside from a little bit of his ethical writings, I've not actually read him. And so, I've tried, but I can't get 2 pages, and I'm not particularly motivated to do it. And so I view myself as having a responsibility, if I'm going to make any definitive claims about another thinker, that I need to be very confident that those claims are true. And that means, in part, spending some real time reading their actual works firsthand. Now, I don't think that means like you have to be an authority and read every word that they ever wrote, and that you can't say anything about Kant unless you read page 1 to the end of the Critique of Pure Reason. But you need to have enough to be very confident that you know what you're talking about. And let me contrast that with another philosopher who I have said a lot about publicly, Rawls. So one of the things I did as we were writing Equal is Unfair is I sat down, and it was actually on a trip here to Michigan before we moved here years ago, and read the entire Theory of Justice. And I read a lot of secondary material and certainly spent a lot of time on Ayn Rand's analysis of Rawls, or at least Rawls as communicated by other thinkers. And so I knew I was on solid ground to say, this is what Rawls advocated, and this is the way in which it was influential, and this is why I think it's wrong. But even there, did I read everything Rawls ever wrote and every version of the Theory of Justice? No, I was totally okay with secondary resources and reading the original version of Theory and Justice that was the most influential. And that's what I went with. And then, if anybody wants to discount me, that's fine. But I felt at that point, all right, I'm confident enough to talk about that. And I haven't gone through that process with Kant. And we'll see. But so far, I have no intention of going through that process with Kant. Maybe his ethics, because as I do become more interested in speaking more about ethics, I think he's an important figure to really know. So, at some point, I probably will dive in more than I have. And that said, I do want to speculate a little bit on why Kant was influential, but I just wanted to underline, I'm saying this as somebody familiar almost exclusively with secondary resources and with other figures in philosophy. And so if you want to dismiss me on those grounds, I totally get it, totally cool with it, but I figure, what the hell, as long as that groundwork has been laid, let me make some points. So my basic answer is that I don't think Kant was convincing. Rather, I think his system won because of 2 factors. Number 1, its precursors were a disaster, which I'll talk about, and two, the liberating effect it had on bad people. So you have to understand that leading up to Kant in philosophy, you basically had two strains in epistemology: the rationalists like Descartes and the empiricists like Locke. And basically what had happened was the empiricist had shown the complete hopelessness of rationalism, the idea that we can just deduce from self-evident primaries everything that we need to know about reality. And then Hume and others came along and exposed all the problems with the empiricists. And, you know, it's easy to be sympathetic to the empiricists like Locke, because we think of Locke as, all right, he, you know, wrote the two treatises of government and was very good on many issues. And I mean, I would even say his heart is in the right place, which is a funny thing to say about a philosopher, but I do think he was really trying to ground knowledge in sensory experience and trying to connect us to reality. But Ayn Rand herself, in the appendix to ITOE, she's asked, like, I think one of the persons says, isn't it true that Locke doesn't even have a concept of reality? And she says, yes. I'd have to look that up to know exactly what she said. But if you think, like, the empiricists had basically been put into this position of, like, saying what we have access to is just experience. And experience is really, and then they are trying to get that there's a relationship between experience and external reality, but they can't really do it. And so they're in effect laying the groundwork for Kant by granting that there's this disconnect between sensory experience and the real world. And so in effect, Kant is just coming along and saying, hey, look, both you guys have been backed into a corner. It's because you're playing the wrong game. It's like you're at a dead end, and let's be honest and move on. Knowledge isn't about reality as it really is. It is just about experiences processed by the structures of our mind. And so nobody can answer him because no one has a positive account that is not susceptible to all the failings, and there's no positive alternative that gives people anywhere to go. Like, philosophy has backed itself into a corner, and the only way out seems to be what Kant's saying, which is stop trying to get to reality as it really is and just play the game of reality as our minds construct it. And so there's no alternative to that. So I think that's a big part of why he succeeds. But then the other part that I think in effect erases the quest for something better is that Ayn Rand has what I think is one of her most profound points, which is that evil philosophies are systems of rationalization, that they give ultimate justification for bad motives like envy and power lust. And so what Kant basically says is, like, have at it, boys. You can't be constrained by reality or reason, and it's deuces wild. And that's really what you get, is you get every form of irrationalism that is really driven ultimately by ethics and, as a consequence, politics, dictating how people should live. And, you know, and so the whole philosophy is just open to any charlatan who's able to capture and lead the mood of the moment. And I think that really is driven by ethics. There's an interesting Facebook post I saw by Robert Bidinato, where he says, look, altruism is based on a zero-sum view of the world, and so maybe to crush altruism, we need to stop even talking about altruism and just crush a zero-sum view of the world. And there's something to that, which is that every ethics is propped up by a metaphysics and epistemology. It's propped up by a whole world view that seems to justify the ethics. But I think if you look at the history of philosophy, you see that it's really the ethics that's driving the metaphysics and epistemology. It's a desire to preserve sacrifice as an ideal that is leading, and certainly Kant, by my understanding, is open about that he's trying to save ethics, and in particular he's saving the Christian ethics from attacks by reason or in the name of reason. And so I think that you can't, you know, like, it's not that people just happen to think the world's zero sum, so it's yes, I guess we have to sacrifice. It's that they think you have a moral obligation to sacrifice, and that leads to an attraction to views of the world that support that. And that's why, that's what a thinker like Kant does, is he gives you a worldview, at least in essentials, that that justifies this moral perspective on life, and that's why people love him. Next question. So my question is, does Ayn Rand's position on Native Americans really bad? So that's not quite grammatical, but they're referring to Ayn Rand gave this Q&A on Native Americans, or on Philosophy Who Needs It, where she's asked a question about Native Americans and the implications for our moral estimate of America. And you can look up the answer that she gave online. I'm not going to go through it, but essentially her view was that it was something like that they were living, as she put it, as primitive savages, and the civilized Europeans had a moral right to come to this country, and that the atrocities that have been put onto the shoulders of the Europeans are ignoring what she thinks are much worse atrocities by the Native American tribes against the settlers. And the questioner goes on to say, now I'm aware that in popular culture, Rand is easily used as a boogeyman, taken out of context, but in this case, they cite her interview response in the Q&A at West Point. Her response, I think, is shockingly bad. It neglects to point out how many times the federal government in the 19th century broke treaties with the Indians, or the notorious plague blanket settlers would offer Indians to kill them. I'm not suggesting the Indians were innocent. They committed violence many times against settlers, but it seems, being a Russian immigrant with a real lack of knowledge of the issue, she should have responded that she wasn't an expert and that she really couldn't offer a proper response. So this question is interesting to me because this question and answer that he's talking about, it had an outsized impact on me because it was the first time, I discovered Objectivism when I was about 15, and this was the first recording I ever heard of Ayn Rand, was her speech on Philosophy Who Needs It, and the Q&A after it. And I must have listened to it literally, with no exaggeration, 300 times, because in those days I was poor as a high school student. I only was able to get maybe 1 or 2 recordings every month or 2 or 3, and so really took this in and heard it a lot. And more than that, I have a vivid memory, or a semi-vivid memory. I don't remember who I was talking to, but I was talking to somebody in high school, and I remember defending this, question and answer specifically, and or maybe just defending the position. The person might not have ever heard the Q&A. And I remember having the experience that, if I put it into words, it was something like, I'm treating Ayn Rand as an infallible authority and committed myself to trying to defend everything she said. And I didn't like that feeling, and yet the alternative seemed more frightening, because it was like, well, if I admit she's wrong about this, then objectivism is wrong, and there goes my framework, and there goes my identity. And so it felt like, no, this was urgently necessary. Like, I had to be able to defend every last word. And at minimum, it was, well, if she's wrong about this, then my opponent wins this debate, and that feels pretty crushing. And I should say, I didn't get that attitude from Objectivism. I had it earlier because I became an atheist before I discovered Ayn Rand, and had a kind of similar sort of attitude towards ideas. I mean, you have to understand, I got interested in philosophy in some form when I was 12 or 13, and had a very polemical orientation. That it was, I thought that to be pro-reason and to take ideas seriously was primarily about really being able to be airtight in my ability to defend those ideas in debates. And so, a lot of my interests were dictated by others and by attacks on my ideas. So I became an atheist, and so it was, well, people make all sorts of claims about the beginning of the universe, so I have to know cosmology, and they make all sorts of claims about evolution, so I have to know evolution. And it was just like my course of study was dictated by attacks on my positions. And so when I became interested in objectivism, it was like, holy God, I have a lot of homework to do, because here's a theory that covers every aspect of human life, including ethics and politics and epistemology and metaphysics. And so now I have to I need to know objectivism's take on the sense reference distinction, and then I have to know about this country in South America that Chomsky says refutes capitalism. And it was just, it was insane, and obviously no human being could really fulfill it. And so eventually there was one insight and two sentences that liberated me. And the insight was that the requirements for knowledge and the requirements for debate are only weakly correlated. And that what that means is that you can have genuine first-handed knowledge, really see a fact in reality, and not be able to defend it in a debate. And it's because what a debate calls upon is the ability to connect your context to another context and process a bunch of, flaws, failures, whatever, in the moment in a really condensed fashion. Versus, and by the same token, you can be great in a debate and actually be completely disconnected from reality. And so once I got that, then that alone took the pressure off and saying, all right, I don't need to win or even engage in a debate to really know what I'm talking about and know why I believe what I believe. And then the two sentences were, I don't know, and I disagree. With respect to, Ayn Rand said this, what's the objectivist view of this? I don't know, or I disagree. And I know it sounds kind of funny, obviously that should be our attitude, but that to me, it didn't really occur to me, or I thought that there was some kind of failure in those questions or in those responses. And once I realized that, no, that's actually just intellectual honesty, and nothing bad happens if you say those two things. Life just got a lot easier, and ideas became a lot more enjoyable, and thinking became much easier because it was not motivated reasoning. It was just my best reasoning that was at play. And I think one thing that, let's say, encouraged or discouraged me from kind of getting to that place earlier is that there are certain features historically of the objectivist movement that I think are changing or have changed that pushed against that. And I want to say a little bit about that. So it is an important question, what is objectivism and who is an objectivist in certain contexts? Particularly, it's important that the people who are presenting themselves as experts and the public advocates for the philosophy and the spokespeople for the philosophy are not misrepresenting the philosophy. That is a real issue. But I think part of what happened is that for a long time, a clear distinction was not made, or at least I don't think it was impressed upon people enough, that's very different from what one's attitude should be towards learning objectivism when you first encounter it, or what one's attitude should be towards people who are not claiming to be spokesmen for the philosophy. And I think in a certain way that this goes back to Ayn Rand, though for innocent, understandable reasons. That is, if you read her and listen to her, and particularly if you hear about Leonard Peikoff's influence on her, she took objectivism as in a way obvious, and the objectivist way of thinking about things as obvious. And it was a slow, and many times painful process to realize how foreign her approach was from the conventional approach. And it was really difficult for her to get how difficult it was for others to learn and internalize her approach. And so there was a sense in which she felt this stuff is obvious and it should be obvious to others because it was so obvious to her. And so there was a pressure that people felt that, that they should get it much faster than they actually could get it. And in this regard, I think Leonard Peikoff does not get enough moral credit because he was one of the few people in Ayn Rand's inner circle who for years and years and a decade or more said, I don't get it. Or I thought I got it and now I'm confused again. And even though it frustrated and sometimes angered Ayn Rand, he would not claim to know more than he actually knew, and he would not hide away his actual confusions over issues. And it would leave Ayn Rand at times baffled and angry at his failures. But I think it was really his kind of moral integrity that then ultimately led him to mastering the philosophy in a way that the other people who said, oh, I get it, and either didn't voice and admit in their later writings and speaking, yeah, I had these doubts or confusions and I didn't say anything. And so part of what happens is that gets radiated out, not Leonard's actual moral approach, but the idea that, yeah, we should get this very fast, it's very obvious. It radiates out during the Nathaniel Branden Institute era, and it was like, you should get this, and if you don't, what's wrong with you? And I think that some of that lingered in the movement. If you listen to Q&As of leading objectivists from the 80s and 90s, there's often a certain impatience or annoyance that crops up to objections, and it reinforced this idea that doubts or hard questions are not welcome. And I'm sympathetic at times because, like, these are people who encountered really badly motivated objections for decades. But nevertheless, I think it really did institute this idea that, like, you should get it, and if not, what the heck's wrong with you? And if you had asked them explicitly, shouldn't people be confused and have a lot of questions, and shouldn't it take a lot of time to understand these ideas? I think they would have said, yeah, of course. But there wasn't a concerted effort to say, look, people, objectivism is a massive body of knowledge that's completely unconventional. Its conclusions, its approach are really hard, and you shouldn't be too quick to understand it and agree with it. You should be actively pushing against it in the sense of asking hard questions. And if you disagree with parts of it, that's fine, as long as as long as you're working to understand the objectivist position and respectfully engage in it. So another way of putting this is we should have been much more clear about our expectations of people who claimed to have mastered and speak for the philosophy, and be very clear that there were radically different expectations for people new to the philosophy, trying to understand the philosophy, or who were interested but disagreed with parts of it. That I don't think those expectations were all made clear in a way that was fully reinforced. And I should say that it's easy to make too much of that. I don't think there was an active attempt to dogmatize people or something like that, once we're talking about the 80s and the 90s, by the best objectivists. I do think there was some of that in lower levels of the movement. Well, that's not even fair. I think there were some people who were high up in the movement, most of them are long gone, who did encourage that kind of thing. But in any case, what I will say is I don't see that anymore. I think this has been one of the best things that I've seen in the last decade or so, is that a real active encouragement of the right mental attitude to have as you're encountering and learning about Ayn Rand has just become a major focus of what objectivists have done, and I think it's made for a much healthier movement. So I'm sorry for that digression, but I did want to make those points. So going then to Ayn Rand's comments about Native Americans. So the first thing I'll say is I don't agree with the questioner about this point when he says, but it seems being a Russian immigrant with a real lack of knowledge on this issue, she should have responded she wasn't an expert and that she couldn't offer a proper response. So first of all, most of the stuff he mentioned was later treatment of Native Americans, which Ayn Rand, I think, is really talking about the actual initial settlement of the United States, or what would become the United States. But even so, she's very explicit. She says, look, my views are based on real scientific reasons, is her wording. And that she's indicating she's aware of the counter arguments, but she believes that they're based on what we would now call, politically correct revisionist history. Now, she might be wrong, but she viewed herself as having thought about this and having good reasons to say what she was saying. And so to just kind of smugly or arrogantly think, oh yeah, she was just clueless, I don't think is fair to her. Now you ask me, well, what were her reasons? What had she studied? What led her to be confident in these conclusions? I have no clue. So this gets to why I have this under the questions I can't answer segment. A, I don't know what she was basing her views on, and B, I have not studied the history of Native Americans. And so, I mean, I'm even a little bit embarrassed to admit, but like I got a very awful history education, and it's just one of those things I've never gotten around to remedy. And so, if you're going to ask me historically about the treatment of Native Americans by the settlers and later by America, I mean, there's a few things in the culture I've heard, but I have not studied it, and vice versa. I'm virtually and sadly ignorant in this area, and so if you asked me, like, was Ayn Rand right or was Ayn Rand wrong? I don't know. I have absolutely no clue. I do want to, though, say that there's principles here she's articulating that I think are defensible if properly understood. So here's what Rand's not saying, what she's often presented as saying, which is, in effect, the Europeans were civilized, so they had a right to land and just like slaughter any native they saw and take over the country, right? Because they were civilized and the Native Americans were, in Ayn Rand's words, savages. That is totally not what she's saying. What she's saying is that the continent did not belong to the Native Americans just because they happened to be here, that they had not established property rights in these areas. And so any place where they were not actually occupying and living their lives, in which case they should have been left alone and dealt with through peaceful means, anybody had a right to come here and establish a society. And ultimately governments and so on. Now, if you ask me how justly did that play out in practice, again, that's what I want to stress. I don't know. If you ask me exactly how should a proper government once established treated tribes, I don't know. I think it's a difficult question, and it's something that I have not thought about, and so I just say, I'm ignorant. But the basic principle that, this was a land that people could come and occupy and create society, I think is right. And that you're not entitled to an entire continent just because you're born there. And another question you could ask is, that said, what do I think of Ayn Rand's rhetoric? And I would say it makes me uncomfortable and I don't like it because I think it's unnecessarily antagonistic and confusing. Now, I get her anger, at least my understanding or my take on it is she's come out and said why she thinks she has a enormously positive estimate of the United States and the basic principles it was founded on. And the kind of question that was raised was, as she would take it, I don't know what was in the questioner's mind, an attempt to say, how can you say America's so good given our treatment of blacks and Native Americans? And I think that's a legitimate question, but she heard it, as best I can understand, coming from the context of the real nihilistic attempt to, in effect, say America's the most evil country and here are its original sins, and in effect what has come to really dominate with things like the 1619 Project, where it's not an attempt to have, let's call it an objective evaluation of America's positives and negatives, but an attempt to wipe out the positives by pointing to these sins. And so I get that, but I don't think that, but that was not made objective. And then if you take some of the language used, like her use of the word savages. Now you have to understand this had nothing to do with racism, and it wasn't a moral judgment. Her view was that you could totally, if you were born a Native American, there was nothing that prevented you from embracing technology, Enlightenment values, reason, science. That there was nothing, but there was nothing inherently noble about actively and willingly and with the ability to have seen civilization to consciously turn away from it to live a primitive existence. She had a real contempt for that. But again, that is that was not objective. That wasn't spelled out, I think, in a way that was understandable to people. And so it is being misused. And I think it was open to being misused by people, like the questioner sent along a salon.com article, who want to portray it as really as racist and as in effect saying, the Europeans could do whatever the heck they wanted to Native Americans. So that's my basic point, is that that she might have been wrong about some things, but I just don't know those issues well enough to say, and I don't know what evidence she was basing her conclusions on well enough to say. I think the principles are right. I think that if you want to communicate those principles effectively, though, I don't think this was the best way to do it. So that's my essential take on that, and I'll be very interested to see how people respond. So this is a fun, kind of silly one. Objectivism battle royale between all the heavy hitters in objectivism. Who wins? So I'm including this as an impossible question just because it's kind of silly and arbitrary, and I don't even really know exactly what it's asking. But if we just kind of assume a certain style, if we assume some meanings of those questions, I think it's actually pretty easy to answer. So one is, who wins in a literal fight? I guess we have to go with Alex Epstein just because he's, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, it's pretty hard to dominate. So that's my best guess there. But if you mean it, who understands objectivism the best and who's the best thinker? Nobody's going to take that mantle from Leonard Peikoff, because I think a handful of people have mastered the philosophy, but those same people would be the first ones to say it was in large part because of him. One of the points Onkar Ghate made once that I thought was really profound was that, we probably know about 4% of what was in Ayn Rand's mind, but 2% of that we know only because of Leonard Peikoff. So one point I really want to stress or point out, that just as an aside, is you really can't know the power of somebody's mind until you've had the experience of, at least metaphorically, being in a room with them and having them give you feedback on something you've written or something you've said, or at least seen up close them do that for somebody else. If all you hear are lectures or Q&As or even read a book, it does not compare to seeing them take something that either seems clear or something that seems like just a pile of confusions and bring massive new clarity to it. I've had the experience with where I would, say something and I thought it was totally on point, or just I have all these confusions, and have somebody spot exactly what's going wrong, the hidden errors that I'm making, the new errors I'm going to make once I try to fix that error based on their feedback. And it is such a powerful experience and so incredible, particularly when you try to do it yourself and realize how hard it is, that you're dealing with a mind that's just another level. And I've only had that experience with 3 philosophers, Leonard Peikoff, Onkar Ghate, and Greg Salmieri. So that gives you, it gives you a sense of how rare it is to have philosophy at that kind of level. All right, so this question's from Zach. Some 6.2 of children ages 5 to 15, or 2.8 million kids, have disabilities ranging from minor social conditions to severe cognitive or physical disabilities. As a parent of both a child with disabilities and typically developing children, my goals, dreams, and interests as a parent differ based on the child. Most of what I have seen on parenting within an objectivist framework focuses on developing a child to become a rational, successful, independent individual, qualities which are not feasible for many. Being that caring for a child with disabilities is rarely a choice, what counsel does objectivism have on caring for disabled children and or adults who are incapable of independent living? So here's a question that's outside my area of expertise, and I don't even feel like I have any interesting points to make. There's a statement attributed at least to Mike Tyson of, everyone has a plan until they're punched in the teeth. And frankly, that's been my experience of parenting. Like I had all sorts of opinions about parenting before I was a parent. And I basically had to toss 99% of them out the window because apparently my kids didn't get the memo and were not cooperating with the plans. I mean, just to give one example, we tried 3 or 4 Montessori schools for our kids, and I've seen Montessori work wonders for young children. I think it's an amazing thing, but it just really was not the right fit for our kids for whatever reason. I mean, like, the bottom line is I find parenting extremely difficult. I have found something helpful in philosophy, but it's mainly just the goal, which is that my goal is to raise children who can be happy in the world, and that has kept me from using them as props for my self-esteem. It's kept me from trying to put them on some track to some artificial notion of success. It's stopped me from trying to indoctrinate them in what my views are, and just really accepting them as who they are and encouraging them to live their best lives. But beyond that, in terms of actual principles of parenting, I feel pretty helpless with my own kids, and how to actually execute on that, I don't know, and often feel like I'm operating by the seat of my pants. So then if you ask me, what guidance do I have for parents with kids with real disabilities? I mean, I literally have nothing to say. All I can say is that, sincerely, I have a lot of sympathy for that. I can't imagine how hard that is. And I have a lot of admiration for parents who do it and can do it and maintain their real just enthusiasm and love of life. And hats off to you. I really, really admire that. Here's a long question that basically amounts to, why aren't there more objectivists in the entertainment field? And I would say, I don't know, but I would even question the premise. If you do the math, there's so few damn objectivists. And it's not obvious we're really underrepresented in the entertainment industry. Certainly conservatives, I think, are underrepresented. But if you think of how competitive these fields are, the fact that, we have one of history's greatest novelists, we have people like Mark Pellegrino, who are well-known actors, somebody like Terry Goodkind, who's one of the leading fantasy writers, considers, or at least I think considers himself an objectivist, and other people, Dennis Miller, Teller from Penn and Teller, have at various times called themselves objectivists at least. And I'm probably leaving out a number of people. I'm just not sure we should expect more at this point. I would say that there is this difficulty to objectivists producing art. And here I'm thinking not of great art. There might be people doing amazing, art that we're just not seeing in popular culture. In fact, I know there are people doing really good art that we're not seeing in popular culture. But there is this challenge that's worth pointing out, which is that, how do I want to put it? Art in the objectivist view is really a product of the artist's sense of life. It's a product of their deepest internal philosophy that, or what would be a philosophy if you gave words to it. And to produce great art, you have to be working from that sense of life. You can't be working from some kind of conception of, intellectually, this is the kind of art I should create. And so historically what we see is either objectivists who try to create objectivist art. This is what an objectivist should like. It should be bright and sunny, and the characters should, speak monosyllabically and be perfect ethically and so on. And it's almost 100% of the time very cringeworthy and bad, because a real artist has to go into war and i.e. be creative with the sense of life they have. That's the only way they're going to create anything original and good. But the fact is that for many of us, precisely because we were not raised in a perfect society and didn't discover objectivism until late, and even if we discovered it early, there's still a lot of cultural influences for whatever reason. Our senses of life are still have elements that are not what you would, that are fully consistent with our explicit philosophy. And there's nothing sinful about that, right? Like, you want to try to improve your sense of life, and you can shape it over time in various ways. But there's no kind of moral obligation to be able to correct something that you can't correct and that was formed before you were even self-aware. And so if you're an objectivist artist who's being genuine and you have these elements, like, that is going to come through in your art. And so what people will see is, oh, well, that's not, maybe I like it, maybe I don't, but it's not, quote, objectivist. So I have a novel coming out next year, and I'm the first one to say it is way darker than anything that, like, you would expect from an Ayn Rand or Victor Hugo. It's much more telling the story. I mean, first of all, it's a like mystery thriller novel, not, you know, not even attempting to do anything like what Ayn Rand was doing. And though it's plot driven, I'm very attracted to gritty realism. You know, if you think about TV shows like The Wire or something, and that is going to come through and is probably going to alienate many of you guys. But in order for me to create something that was coming from me and not what I'm supposed to create, or even what I intellectually recognize as superior in an aesthetic sense, I had to just be true to that part of me. And so I would say, like, my expectation is just that it's going to be a long time before there's a lot of great art and entertainment that you would say is really kind of reflective of of a sense of life that fully articulated would amount to kind of an objectivist take on life. And I'm totally willing to be pleasantly surprised if any of you go out there and do that. So you have my best encouragement, but you also have my encouragement to just create art that's really you, and you know, try to succeed in the world. Like, look, the world needs more great art, but it needs more pretty good art too. It needs more fun entertainment too. So, like, don't view creation as like, I'm doing it for a cause and I'm doing it for the sake of the philosophy, or I'm doing it to prove something about, like, here's another way to put it, and maybe this is too strong, but part of my view is, like, I leave objectivism behind when I'm creating artistically. And I keep whatever's really deeply instilled just in my way of coming at the world. And whereas when I'm publicly advocating for things, that's not going to be true, right? You know, if I have some element of my psychology that's still wedded to bad premises, like, I'm not going to come out and advocate for that just because it's there. But in art, like, that's going to feed me things that, you know, I can edit if I think that's not really what I want to express, but I'm not going to be able to make it vanish. And I don't think there's any reason why you should try to make it vanish. Like, just create stuff that you love and put it out there in the world. And that to me is a worthy undertaking. So I hope that you got a lot out of a series of answers that you're intended to get nothing out of. And I will talk to you next time when we will get back to subjects that I actually know. All right. Let me know what you think. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, leave your comments, leave a like, and sign up for the email list at donswriting.com. And I will talk to you soon.